Hi guys, this is Mrs. Anderson, and I'm going to go over the introduction of our Passion Unit, which is where we are going to be reading The Tragedy of Macbeth by William Shakespeare. And for Shakespeare, we do need to have a little bit of background information so that we can better understand his dramas, since the language is Elizabethan English and not our newer modern English language that we are most familiar with. So the first thing we're going to talk about is about this being as part of our Passion Unit. So you will want to pause throughout this presentation so that you can take some notes on different keywords and phrases, important dates, characters from the drama, and background information that is going to help you to better understand the tragedy of Macbeth. So you're going to want to get some lined paper and your pencil and take notes in a notebook or in a binder where you're going to access them throughout the unit. So again, pause as you need to and then restart when you get the opportunity. So this unit is our Passion Unit, and the word passion unit has the word passion has a positive connotation. So by definition, passion is an intense desire or enthusiasm for something. So when we talk about being passionate about something, it's not just a love interest. It doesn't have to be a romantic kind of thing. It can be that we are passionate about nature, that we love nature and we want to care for it and do what we can so that our world will be beautiful and fruitful for the upcoming decades. Maybe we are passionate about our grades. Maybe we're passionate about family. In your notes, I want you to give it the heading Passion Unit, and I want you to write down 3 to 5 things that you are truly passionate about in life. These can be anything that is personal to you. Maybe you want to work for social justice in a certain aspect of society. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. I want you to make a list of 3 to 5 things that you personally are truly passionate about. So go ahead and take a moment to do that, and pause this if you need to take some time to write those down. For this next part, you don't have to take any notes. I just want you to think about these questions. Have you ever complained about your parents, teachers, leaders, or government? Have you ever been egged on to bad behavior by friends, meaning they encourage you or peer pressure you to do something that is not the best behavior? Have you ever felt like life was unfair to you and that you deserve better? Have you ever wondered about destiny versus free will? What is meant to be versus choices that you will make? Have you ever felt guilty about something you said or did? Have you ever thought, life is just a meaningless series of events? Or have you ever thought, is there a basic morality or goodness that we should all follow, all human beings? These are some of the things that come up through the story of Macbeth. Now, some other enticing and engaging ideas are listed here on your screen for you. We are going to come across things like witches, treachery, blood, murder, faithless, ambition, deception, and leadership within the story of Macbeth. And so when you think about the kinds of movies and television shows you like to watch or stories that you read that interest you the most, think about the kind of person you are, what your interests are, what your interest in humanity is. Macbeth has a little bit of something for everyone, which is what makes it really exciting. Not only that, but Shakespeare has a way of writing that reminds readers that humans are complex individuals, meaning we are multi-layered. We are just not what is our facade. We have depth to us and we have complex minds. And so the one thing a person can never really know is the thought and intention of another human being, which is kind of scary because even those that are closest to us, like parents or siblings or best friends or significant others, we never truly know what's going on in their minds. Think about all the secrets that you've kept from different people over the years. So Shakespeare brings this out through his writing and reminds his audiences that we never truly know and understand another human being. Now, Shakespeare wrote Macbeth in the 1600s, so it is a 17th century piece, and written in approximately 1606. It was during a time of tremendous political problems. There were a lot of suspicions and superstitions that were happening in society, and a new king had just come into power. So the country was really restless. They didn't know how things were going to change, what was going to be different. And so that was all part of the inspiration of Shakespeare's play Macbeth. Now, one of the interesting things about playwrights of the time is that in order for your play to be performed, to be acceptable for an audience, you had to really kind of think of your intended audience, which would have been the leadership at the time, so whomever was the king or queen. In this case, King James was on the throne, and so Shakespeare would have gained his approval for this play by King James, and so King James kind of had to sign off on whether or not it was appropriate to be shown. And so one of the things that King James really took interest in was the superstitious witches, the acts of the devil. And so witches were representatives for the devil, and King James was really interested in learning more about witches and witchcraft and supernatural events, so much so that he had written a book. So Shakespeare played to that and included witches and supernatural elements into Macbeth. He also made a connection between King James and one of his, who would have been an ancestor of his, within the play. And so playing into that really would have engaged King James in the story. So you should take some notes on that. Again, talking about, who was in power at the time. It was King James. You would want to take some notes on the fact that King James was very interested in the supernatural, and that Shakespeare's audience would have been intrigued by supernatural events like witches. So, as we often find in literature, when we're studying something fictional, we oftentimes ask, is any of it real, though? Are any aspects of it real? We have to keep in mind that dramas are meant to be performed, that they are dramatic performances. And so most stories are embellished a little bit if they are partly true, so that the audience can remain engaged, because no one's life on every second of every day is extremely interesting. But here are some interesting components. Shakespeare did tap into the history of the time. There was a King Duncan, there was a Macbeth, and there was a Banquo. The interesting thing about those characters, though, is that they weren't entirely the same way that Shakespeare had them characterized within his drama Macbeth. King Duncan is a very honorable character in the book, but in real life he was a much weaker and not incredibly trustworthy king. Where in our drama of Macbeth, he is a stand-up character, really important, really interesting. And the other characters are similar to that as well. Shakespeare portrays them in an almost opposite way of how they were in real life. Now, there was no official Lady Macbeth as we know her in the story, but there was a woman named Gruach, and she was a princess who married into royalty, and there are associations around an individual named Macbeth and Scottish kings and things of that nature, but Gruach herself is not exactly the Lady Macbeth that is portrayed in the story, just a popular individual in society that Shakespeare had included in the drama Macbeth. So you can pause and take some general notes. Again, dates, characters, time frames, general information is really important. Okay, so fact versus fiction. When we're reading any kind of drama or fictional text, we have to accept it for what it is. We can do some background information that will help us to better understand what it is that we're reading. And this slide is another one of those kind of things where we're looking at the portrayal of the storyline behind King Duncan and Macbeth as Shakespeare has designed his play. So it is not historically correct. This is not one of his histories that he has written. Shakespeare had 3 types of dramas that he wrote: histories, tragedies, and comedies. This one is a tragedy. So even though there are historical names, it's really removed from what the correct history is. And so it's important to understand that. We also have a little bit more of an explanation on this slide about Macbeth's friend Banquo and how he is portrayed. And Banquo is considered an ancestor, historically speaking, to King James, which again is that connection to that character that King James would have been interested in for the story Macbeth. So King James, again, is interested in both supernatural elements and how his family line is going to show up within the story. And his family line shows up in the character Banquo. Now, we do have to keep in mind that this is a stage play. So this performance was on a stage. And so you had theater goers at the Globe, and you've already learned a little bit about the Globe, but very limited scenery during that time. Shakespeare wrote very few stage directions into his play because most of that was part of the character dialogue. So the way that a character performed, they would come out on stage and say, "Oh, look into the forest over there." And instead of having scenery of a forest, just the implication of what the character had said would be enough for the audience to understand that that is, in their imagination, supposed to be a forest. And so it's important for us to remember as we are reading that all of this was performed on stage, which means that there are limitations to the actions that can take place on stage. So some deaths, some other things that kind of come into play, it's very difficult to do that on an open air stage. And so that's why the stage had trap doors. That's why some of the actions will take place off stage, but you have to pay very close attention to the dialogue. As we begin to read Macbeth, you will learn that it takes place in the middle of things, in medias res. That is Latin for saying that a story starts in the middle of things. So in this case, the story of Macbeth begins in the middle of a war. It is a war between Scotland and Norway, and the Scottish king is King Duncan, and there is a traitor from Scotland who is trying to overthrow King Duncan, and that traitor is working with Norway. So you have prestigious warriors, Macbeth and Banquo, who are within the first act. They are fighting for King Duncan, who is well loved and an excellent leader. So you're going to want to definitely take some notes on this so that you remember that it picks up in the middle of things, that there's no real clear beginning to this story, that would be like a once upon a time kind of thing. Act 1, Scene 1, and you see the 1.1, that is how you would cite an act and scene. And if you had line numbers, it would be Act 1.1, Scene 1, which is there, and then dot, and then the line numbers, if that's what you were referencing. So our play opens up with some witches, and they are on a Scottish heath. So a large piece of land that's just grassy land out in the middle of Scotland, and you have these three witches, and they're saying and doing all kinds of crazy things. And Shakespeare chooses to start this way, one, to engage King James, but also to kind of terrify his audience and get them engaged in the scene as well. Remember that the audience knows that witches represent the devil, so they would have been very fearful of this play starting out with witches, and they would have been very cautious, and it would have immediately kind of hushed the crowd for them to find out what is going on. So these witches are going to present some paradoxical kind of words that we're going to review when we read it together. But I just want you to be aware that that is how Shakespeare starts the play, and we can understand that he would start it with some excitement, just like a movie might start with some excitement, so that it engages the audience immediately. So again, take some notes on that. Once you take notes on that, the very last thing you're going to do today is go into Schoology. There is a discussion post, and in that discussion post, you are going to be asked to answer two questions. Those questions are, number one, what are you most looking forward to with this unit, this Passion unit, studying the tragedy of Macbeth, based on the background knowledge and anticipation guide work. So based off of this presentation and the work that you've done up to this point for Shakespeare and Macbeth, what are you most looking forward to? And number two, how do our passions, and you'll refer back to that first couple of slides where you made a list of 3 to 5 passions, how do they guide our life choices? And I want you to explain that. And if your passions currently do not guide your life choices, I want you to explain how you are going to start taking steps that help you to move towards your passion, to attaining those goals with your passions. All right, guys, take care.